So I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from you today, Axel. Today you will be talking to us for 30 to 40 minutes, plus 30 minutes Q&A on the topic of Facebook's Australian news ban and its implications for critical platform studies.
All right, thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here and see you all in person. This has gone on for a while, trying to find a time and make this happen. We've had a few plans over the course of the year really by now, and that have been thwarted by lockdowns and various other problems as well. So yeah, really good to be here just before the year ends and before we all disappear on all of this. This is my penultimate speaking engagement, I think, before I go on this. Happy to before we all disappear. And thank you for that great introduction. I feel like I'm talking probably on a slightly narrower topic today than what I could be talking about with the Laureate and other projects as well. But I'm very happy as well, obviously, about the various areas of research that we might have connections as well. So yeah, very happy to pick up on a lot of these things in further conversation as well. And just on the Laureate Fellowship itself, one thing I do want to say, if you happen to know anyone, I've just advertised for postdocs, 5-year postdocs on the Laureate. So if you know of anyone who might be interested, then probably the easiest thing is to go to the website nerd.info and yeah, have a look there. There's more information there about these postdocs, and then you can find the job ads on the QT website as well. Obviously, I'm not trying to push anyone from here, but if you happen to have any people in your networks, then please let them know. So,
sorry, Axel, if I could just remind our online audience, if you could mute your mics, that would be really great. We have some interference. Thank you. Sorry.
And actually, sorry, one thing I should have done at the start as well is just to acknowledge the additional owners of the lands on which we meet. I think we're still in federal and government country here, so I'd like to acknowledge them as the owners of lands where QT as well as Griffith stands, and pay my respects to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and recognize that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. I want to acknowledge, obviously, the important role that Indigenous peoples play within the QT communities as well. So thank you for that. So I guess what I'm talking about here, there'll probably be kind of two parts to this talk. One is very specifically about the Facebook news ban episode, how we got there, what happened, and what we learned from it. The second part is probably going to be a little bit more anti, and talk more broadly about the implications of this, and really what it tells us about the power of platforms like Facebook, and particularly its power also over the kind of research that we are able to do on these platforms, and what we need to do as researchers to kind of push back against that as well. But let me start with the Facebook news ban, which by now is kind of a while ago, in pandemic times, probably a few years ago, although it was only February this year. And just to give you a bit of context, I'm sure you'll remember this still reasonably well, but this, of course, is linked very much to the News and Media Bargaining Code that the government had been mooting for some time at the end of last year, and then finally introduced into Parliament in February this year. So really the idea, as you see there from ACMA, was to, as it says there, address bargaining power imbalances between digital platforms and Australian news businesses, trying to essentially provide a better footing for Australian news businesses to get a bigger share of the advertising pie, particularly on Facebook and other major online platforms. There's a timeline there broadly from the middle of last year onwards via various concept papers and submissions and drafting and so on to the legislation in February 2021. That all seems a little more straightforward than it probably was in practice, but that's what happened. Of course, as soon as the government started to talk about this, the major platforms rightly possibly perceived it as a threat to their business models and to their independence from Australian government regulation. So Google, as you might remember, put out these sorts of warnings saying the way Aussies use Google is at risk. whenever you went to the Google front page. Facebook said, and that's a bit small for me to read actually, but it said, assuming this draft code becomes law, we will reluctantly stop allowing publishers and people in Australia from sharing local and international news on Facebook and Instagram. So they were quite explicit about this quite early on. From August last year, basically, they were talking about, well, we might just ban news, not just Australian news, but any news on Facebook for Australian users. The ACCC responded to this and said, well, but, news is such an important part of what happens on Facebook, so we don't think they're going to do that. So many Australians, 39, if I see that right, percent of Australians use Facebook for general news. So why would Facebook take all of this off if it's so important to Australians? Facebook responded to that by saying, well, yes, it might be important for Australians to have news on Facebook, but it's not important for Facebook to have Australian news on its platform. So, yes, people use Facebook to inform themselves, but at the same time, news is just a fractional part of what actually happens on Facebook. And that's actually quite correct as well. So in fairness to Facebook, I guess, and I don't say this lightly, but in fairness to Facebook, they're right. News is not actually an important part of what happens on Facebook, but it is important to Australians to have news on Facebook. So that's kind of the two sides of the debate essentially that happened from August last year onwards. And then the government very helpfully got involved and said they're bluffing. They're going to call their bluff. We're going to introduce this legislation and let's see what they really do. Christian Porter, in all his wisdom, said, yeah, we're not going to be dictated to by these platforms, and we're just going to call it. Except, of course, it wasn't. So as they introduced this into Parliament, suddenly on the 18th of February, and you may remember this from your own experience if you're on Facebook, on major news pages, Australian news pages on Facebook, suddenly there was no content anymore. ABC looked like it had never posted anything on its Facebook page. If you were trying to go to specific posts that contained news on Facebook, you'd see this content isn't available at the moment. If you're trying to post any links to news yourselves, you would see this kind of notice. You can't currently post any links to news pages, to news in Australia or global. So that's the sort of experience. But then also, of course, it went much further than this, and even news adjacent pages like the Bureau of Meteorology or Queensland Health were now empty of posts. And that's obviously deeply problematic, particularly in the middle of the pandemic. Not to have any more news updates from the major state and federal health pages, for instance. So that's the full kind of breadth of what we saw in the middle of this newsround. To give you an idea of what that looks like, so we did some data work fairly quickly around that time to gather basically activity from Australian public Facebook pages overall. So any kind of public pages on Facebook that were seen as Australian by CrowdTangle, the data access portal for Facebook, and it's a little bit tricky the way that they identify this, but essentially they're counting public pages that have a majority of their admins based in Australia as Australian Facebook pages. Now, that may not capture some Australian pages that might be administered from overseas. If news.com.au, let's say, has outsourced its admins to Vietnam somewhere, then they're not going to show up. But it covers the vast majority of Australian pages, and really the only access, unfortunately, that we have, and I'll say more about that later. So this is a pretty thorough collection of Australian-related public Facebook pages that we've got there. And this is what it looked like. At the top there, you see the level of posting of posts that contain links to Australian news sources. So I've compiled a list of about 35 Australian news outlets, news domains online, and here basically extracted from my data the posts that contain links to any of these domains, so to articles on those sites and so on. And you see there how that drops down quite significantly and just drops down further and further over the course of that week. So that's posting of links to these domains. So in the first few days of the news ban, there is still some posting actually going on for whatever reason and in whatever ways. So Facebook didn't perhaps introduce this fully just yet, and didn't quite crack down on all sorts of loopholes that people might have been finding via, let's say, short links, bit.ly links, or whatever that people might have wrapped around their URLs. Some of that was still getting through. But even if it was getting through, and you see that at the bottom of that graph, interactions drop down to basically zero during this time. So even if some of these pages and ordinary users were still able to post bit.ly links that then resolved to the ABC or whatever, those posts were still not available to other users of Facebook for interacting with. And so interactions overall flatline essentially during this time. You see that that's really the impact. So that's the period of the Facebook news ban from early on the 18th to early on the 26th of February. That's literally the impact that we saw. This compares this with the overall volume of activity in the entire Australian news pages data, Australian Facebook pages data set. So the red line there is activity on Facebook at the top there in terms of posts being made on Australian public pages. And the red line at the bottom is interactions with those posts. And you see that basically continues unabated during this time. Facebook news ban, this is the period of the Facebook news ban. Well, you see in the turquoise line at the bottom, that's news posts. That's basically what I've just shown you in the other graph. But the red line is just, as normal. Nothing happens other than during that period, which just happens to be the weekend. So that's the drop down in posting activity over the weekend. It's not related to the news ban. And I think the rise in interaction activity on the weekend might have been related to sports events or something else that were happening on that Sunday. So we see more interaction on Facebook during that. But so Facebook is, I hate to admit, right in saying that news is not an important part of what happens on Facebook, both in posting and in interactions. It is a small fraction of that, of activity. And for news posting and interaction to drop out of Facebook in Australia altogether, as it did during these days, had no discernible effect on anything else that happened on Facebook in Australia, or at least in these public pages and around these public pages in Australia. So that's the reality of it, and that's why Facebook could do this without really having any kind of significant impact on its own business bottom line or whatever else. I'd hate to say it, but many Australians might not even have noticed that news was gone, basically, because if they're not following Australian news pages, if they just get news occasionally shared in their news feeds, well, they might have not noticed that, hey, for those 2 days or 5 days or whatever it was, there was no news in their news feeds. It was just all the other stuff. So that's the reality of what we saw. Now, I might go through this a bit quickly, but essentially, so the logic of what I'm showing you here is basically, in the first place, here the links per day, the top domains being linked to on Facebook in the pre-ban period, that's on the left, in the period during the ban, in the middle, and in the period after the ban on the right. I'll just really compare the pre-ban and ban period here, I think, but essentially what we see very clearly is that ABC, 7 News links are always very much at the top of the list. So they are some of the most shared links, some of the most shared domains on Facebook. But of course, they're dropping down very precipitously during the news ban itself. They themselves and others are still trying to post links, and some of them are getting through, probably via bit.ly and other URL shorteners and various other mechanisms. But essentially, they drop down very significantly. Google links remain unaffected, and I think that's also one of the ways that people have tried to get around the news ban by posting basically a link to a Google search for a particular article rather than a link to the article itself. YouTube links also remain unaffected because Facebook didn't want to pick a fight with YouTube or Google or Alphabet for that matter. Bit.ly links do drop down as well. So I think that's in part also, again, because some of the encapsulated links are actually being blocked. And oddly enough, the Epoch Times, which is the sort of Chinese, problematic news outlet, let's say, drops down a little bit, but not that much. So maybe it's just not classified as news by Facebook. But that remains to be seen. Looking at the top links being shared during the ban period, of course, that changes quite significantly. So Google's very much at the top. There's a new outlet called news.china.com.au, which didn't actually appear in the pre-ban period and just appears in the ban period. Maybe that's a new launch. I'm not sure. We haven't really had a chance to look at it in detail, but that just happens to launch by the looks of it in the period just when everything else that's new on Facebook is being banned. So it's quite possible that Facebook again might not have classified it as news yet or as Australian news yet at that point, and that's why it's still being able to be shared. We see Twitter rise. I mean, that's almost doubling in volume. And that's, I think, because people, again, are posting tweets that link to news outlets as one way of getting around the news feed. And again, Facebook might not have wanted to pick a fight with Twitter by banning all links to tweets being shared. And then interactions, though, is another and much more significant story. So posting, as I said, is still possible to an extent, but interactions, as you see there, for news sites drop down to zero, essentially. I mean, in 99%, essentially, for ABC, 7, SBS, 9 News. So they're all basically disappearing because, yes, you might still be able to get a post through somehow, but they're just not visible, essentially. News satire, at the same time, flourishes because that's really the only kind of news-adjacent content that's still available on Facebook during this time. So, you know, your chasers, the Twitter advocates and so on, they're doing quite well out of all of this. Partly also, of course, because they're posting a number of satirical posts. I think the Twitter advocates said, hey, we're the last news site still standing in Australia. So, of course, they're getting a lot of engagement from us. Google as a pathway to news as well. Again, interactions with Google links increase, or actually remain the same at least. And that's, I think, because of that. Bitly links, again, could be posted, but drop down very significantly in terms of interactions. Food media, I think, were affected early on because they were also classified as news. And then I think that ban was reversed as they started to complain about this, which was the same with the Bureau of Meteorology, these sorts of sites as well. So I think that's why you see a partial drop down for a while, but then they kind of come back a bit earlier. And again, YouTube is also an important pathway to news during this time. So people are sharing videos from the ABC rather than ABC articles. And then the biggest winners, I guess, in terms of interactions. So, you know, again, the news satire sites like the Twitter advocates, news satire chaser there as well. Chaser goes up, sorry, by 400% compared to its normal engagement. So again, that might just be one or two really high profile posts that make fun of the situation. Engagement with tweets being posted again basically doubles. And so on. And then really what's left is, you know, a lot of lifestyle, food and sports and other kind of content that isn't news in a narrow and political sense, but that's sort of where attention seems to be directed at a time when news itself just isn't accessible. So that's, I kind of wanted to show you this just as an example of the sort of impact that this really has. And of course, the aftermath, you might know this, and that really I can't read from here, but essentially the government kind of didn't say it backtracked, but it backtracked by giving essentially a commitment to Facebook and Google that they wouldn't be designating these platforms under the News Media Bargaining Code in return for Facebook and Google paying some, or entering into negotiations with some Australian news outlets to pay some limited amount of money. I mean, it's good money for Australian news publishers. It's in the tens of millions in a number of cases, but for Facebook and Google, that's you know petty cash basically. So so in essence, the platforms won, I would say. Yes, there is money coming to Australian news publishers. There is absolutely no requirement for Australian news publishers to invest that in journalism. So it could all just go to shareholders if they wanted to. There is some additional money coming to these publishers, but also there is no requirement for the platforms to negotiate with all Australian news publishers, as long as they make some efforts with some of them. And you might be aware that there is obviously some discussion still going on about which publishers should engage in negotiation with these platforms, particularly around the public broadcasters as well. So this is basically the solution that you have when you have got a solution, I think. And essentially the outcome is platforms can still do what they want to be doing, as long as they show that they are willing to negotiate with some publishers, and as long as some publishers get some money out of it, particularly, of course, some of the commercial publishers that would make the biggest stink out of all of this. But the platforms are not, these platforms at least, are not governed by the News Media Bargaining Group because they haven't been designated under the group. And they're not going to be either, at least for the large amount of this government. So that's essentially the outcome. And so I would say Facebook, Facebook actually quite successfully called bluff of the Australian government in this respect, and managed to get away with it. And that's sorry to end that part on a kind of down note, but that's essentially, I think, what happened. So in some ways, this is, well, platforms behaving badly, but particularly Facebook behaving badly, and throwing its weight around essentially to avoid legislation that would have been a much bigger problem for it, not just in Australia, but also as a precedent for other legislation that other countries and regions around the world might have wanted to try. And it's quite successfully avoided that. And I think the enthusiasm in other countries and in the EU for regulating platforms in this way has waned, I think, quite a bit as well, based on the Australian experience. So let me say a bit more then about all of this. Facebook has been on the defense for some time, of course, since this kind of stuff, obviously. So this is kind of the rantier and broader part of the talk, where I want to say a bit more about what's been going on in platform politics, I guess, for a while now. Ever at least since the Cambridge Analytica moment, which of course was a big scandal in 2018. Facebook has been called in front of Mark Zuckerberg, Commander Data has been called in front of various Congress hearings and other platform providers. It's not just Facebook, but obviously Facebook tends to be the biggest of them all. Have been called in front of Congress and other hearings, also in the EU, to talk about the power that they have and how they're exercising that power and what the problems are that they're causing by not doing enough about hate speech and misinformation and so on, of course. So for some time now, they have been on the defense to a certain extent. The immediate reaction that they had, in fact, however, when they were pulled up for these things and when they were embroiled in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, was essentially to make it harder for outsiders to actually investigate the significance of this and any other kind of problem. So the first thing, almost literally the first thing that Facebook did when Cambridge Analytica properly broke was to say, well, we're killing off the Instagram API immediately. We're going to severely restrict the Facebook API to make it, ostensibly to make it more difficult for organizations and actors like Cambridge Analytica to gather data from our platform, but in practice, really to make it much more difficult for independent research to observe what happens on these platforms. That's really the major effect of restricting APIs in this way, because the commercial partners that Facebook has continue unabated to work with data from the platform. Other platforms, I do want to acknowledge, did something similar as well. So Twitter also restricted some API functionality and has moved to a new API model, although Twitter has been a lot more engaged with the research community through all of this, and I kind of want to acknowledge that as well. I'm really showing this just because I love the picture so much. It's just, wonderful stock art. But Facebook really kind of did a bait and switch in some ways as well. So it kind of restricted, almost killed off its API, and at the same time introduced this thing called Social Science 1 in partnership with or under the leadership of researchers at Harvard University, and kind of tried to position Social Science 1 as its major new way for academics to access data. It did this in part, or it actually ran quite a sophisticated and smart PR strategy to say, well, Cambridge Analytica, you know how there's Cambridge in the name, so this really is an academic problem. Academics have abused the data. Although Facebook has itself come out and said very clearly in its early press releases that Cambridge Analytica did what any other user of our platform would have done as well, which is, ask users for permission to access their data and access that data. So they didn't leak anything, they didn't breach any rules of Facebook, they just accessed a lot of data in a maybe immoral way, but not in a way that was against our rules. But they managed to tar the entire academic community basically with the Cambridge Analytica case by saying, well, this was academics. And so we shut down the API and we introduced this new thing, which will be a much more controlled way of releasing good quality data under carefully constructed mechanisms to accredited researchers. And that's what they did, and that's what it looked like. The problem with this was that it never actually worked. So about a year or so after they introduced Social Science 1, practically no data had been provided to researchers, to the point that the advisory committee of Social Science 1, which is constructed of a number of fairly high power and high profile academics in the field, said, well, we've had enough of this. As it says, the Social Science 1's work with Facebook has been continuously delayed. More than a year and a half into the venture, and Facebook has yet to release the full set of URLs data it promised. And that's not even saying anything about other data sets that we have also talked about at some point. So Facebook made it, which is unfortunately a pattern in how it acts publicly. It made grand announcements and got the press for it, but it never actually followed through in providing any significant amount of data to researchers as a result. Then it turned out that even some of the data that did make available was incomplete, and in fact was just covering half of the US users that it had promised would be covered in that data set. And Facebook didn't, notice that or inform anyone about it. It took a great colleague of mine, Fabio Giulietto from the University of Urbino in Italy, to find out and to do the detective work, essentially, to say, well, actually, we're getting this very limited data set, but it's half of what it should be. It's half the size of what it should be. It's covering half the users that it should be covering. So Facebook is not giving us the full data set. And that really then became a big story, as you see in Gadget, but also in the New York Times and other outlets that report about this. And again, Facebook was forced on the defensive about that as well, but nothing much has changed. And then really it, I guess, increasingly has gone on the offense as well. So this is all about restricting access for users. But what it then also did was quite deliberately go after some of the researchers who were still trying to do really critical Facebook research. And again, I'm not necessarily just talking about Facebook here, but Facebook is probably one of the worst behaved of the bunch at this point. So this is the front page of the New York University Ad Observatory. This has a kind of a long history. Initially, in the 2016 US election, there was a project by the website ProPublica, which was essentially inviting Facebook users to install a browser plugin that would report the political ads that they were seeing in their news feeds. Just gather them from the news feed and send them to a central server. Eventually, this was taken on and taken over by New York University, which runs this ad observatory. And again, it works very much on the same basis. Still, you install the plugin in your browser. That's active when you surf Facebook, and as you scroll through your newsfeed, it picks up on the ads that you see. And it's doing that to understand, well, what ads is Facebook running, or are advertisers running on Facebook? How are they targeting you? Is there anything problematic there in terms of ads that are deliberately trying to misinform or target vulnerable groups with alcohol and tobacco advertising, all these sorts of things. So that's what it is, and that's what it still looks like. And it's still there. However, what Facebook did when it had enough of this kind of critical research was to say, well, we are now blocking the personal accounts, pages, apps, and access to our platform by the researchers who are involved in this project. So not targeting the ad observatory itself, because there wasn't really anything for it to target, because it is entirely run as a browser plugin on people's computers, so Facebook couldn't shut that down, but targeting the individual researchers involved in that project. And in essence, the weird thing is that this does nothing to change anything about how the ad observatory works. So it makes it so much harder for these researchers to access Facebook, to access the Facebook ad library, to check the ads that they're seeing in their data set against what is on the Facebook ad library, and of course to use other Facebook data tools like CrowdTable, which require a Facebook account to work. So in essence, this is pure chicanery essentially by Facebook against these researchers to make their lives more difficult in many other ways. By shutting down their Facebook access, while the project itself can continue unabated. Then it also actually said, well, we're doing this because the Federal Trade Commission, says to us, well, this, the way that they're gathering data might be violating U.S. consumer protections, to the point that the acting director of the FTC, Consumer Protections Bureau, had to come forward and say that the insinuation that the agency's order required the disabling of the accounts was inaccurate. So the Facebook said, well, the FTC told us to shut these people down. FTC had to say, well, but no, we didn't. And how dare you say this? So this is, again, the kind of dirty play, essentially, and the playing of the man or the woman rather than of the issue that Facebook has been engaging with more recently. And I think obviously that's very, very deeply problematic. More broadly as well, there are other concerns that Facebook might also shut down the last remaining major point of access to major quality point of access to Facebook data, which is CrowdTable. CrowdTable has an interesting history, and I think I'll say that in a minute. But CrowdTable essentially was an independent company that Facebook bought up in 2016. CrowdTable provides data, as I said, around the case study of the news ban on public activity, public pages, public groups, public verified profiles on Facebook and Instagram and other platforms. So it has for a long time existed sort of as a separate entity within the overall kind of Facebook concept. That's long been a thorn in Facebook's eyes because it did provide researchers, and it still does provide researchers with useful data to understand what happens on Facebook in a more objective kind of way without having to rely on Facebook releasing particular data sets to us. However, as it turned out, Facebook's executives have been getting increasingly worried about the way that CrowdTable helps people understand what happens on Facebook. So the perception that they're amplifying harmful content. People were enthusiastic about the transparency CrowdTable provided until it became a problem for Facebook and created press cycles that Facebook didn't like. And these are all kind of internal rumorings that have been released and gradually been published in the New York Times elsewhere. People wouldn't be surprised if Facebook executives tried to kill off CrowdTable entirely or starve it off resources. And that starvation arguably has begun by now. Facebook has a lot of the original CrowdTable execs have left Facebook. A lot of the team in CrowdTable has left Facebook. I kind of come into this picture slightly peripherally because I posted something about all of this on Twitter, not on Facebook, but on Twitter, and the ex-CEO of CrowdTable actually responded and said, yeah, look, at some point we planned to include comments on these pages in the data that we're providing. We're actually starting on our way to adding comments integration, but that's basically now just not happening because all of us who've been working on this are no longer there. So again, this is kind of Facebook again starving CrowdTable of resources and thereby reducing the utility of the last major access point for what happens on Facebook. So this is really the story that we're dealing with in this. So and this is where I wanted to finish up, I guess. What now? What happens there for us as we do this kind of research? And where, what's left essentially for researchers to do in this kind of space? It's I think, hopefully, I don't need to argue for this. It is important to observe what happens on these platforms, and particularly on Facebook, because it is still the 100-pound or 500-pound gorilla in the room, obviously, particularly internationally. It is still very, very central and rule. And there are many other platforms around them as well. So it's really important for us to understand what happens on these platforms. It's very important for us to understand how much mis and disinformation, how much hate speech and abuse, how many other problematic forms of activity are actually circulating on Facebook, and who's engaged in them. And the same goes obviously for other social media platforms as well. So what can we still do? This is based on an article I published in Information Communication Society about 2 years ago now. So in that article, I kind of outlined 4 possible options there, and so let me take you briefly through them, then hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. The first is to basically just walk away, and a number of people have done this. Bernard Lieder from the University of Amsterdam, who developed some really critical tools for understanding what happens on Facebook when the Facebook API was still there, has basically walked away and has said, well, I just can't maintain my tools anymore because Facebook won't let me in. There's nothing much else I can do, so I'm just moving on to other things, basically. And that's happened. TextSift, DataSift, another tool that's been more important for Twitter perhaps than for Facebook, has also basically said, well, we can't actually get the data anymore that we've required to provide our service, so we're shutting this down essentially. The second thing that we can and we must do, I think, is continue to lobby and to advocate for better access to data. And this is again, this is not so much an article that I've written, but this is an article, really an open letter to Facebook that we published in sort of the aftermath of the Cambridge Analytica thing. We've had literally hundreds of researchers from around the world who signed this and noted the issues with the continued shutdowns and reductions in data access for researchers. So we must continue to lobby for better access. And I'm encouraged that there is some lobbying going on both in the US and in the EU particularly as well for this. This is some lobbying that Algorithm Watch has been doing in the EU to stop, again, I like the image there, to stop Facebook and other platforms from suppressing research that's in the public interest. So we'll see where that goes, and obviously there are some issues that need to be thought through there as well. This is not about simply giving us access to everything all the time, but it is about providing better mechanisms for access that aren't like social science one, just from Facebook to delay things again. We obviously still need to continue to work with what we've got. This is CloudHandle, it's still there, and it can still be used for certain things. So we need to continue to work with these sorts of tools, but we also need to make sure that we're not entirely reliant on them anymore. And again, there are some other tools around that Facebook actually has said it will introduce, the Facebook Online Research or Open Research Tools initiative. We'll see where that goes. We need to hold them to account, I think, again, in all of these announcements that they're making about how we might be able to access their data in the future, that this actually happens and provides useful data. So it's not about just giving good PR to Facebook for the next social science one, but actually following up and saying, well, does it do what it said it would be doing? And the jury's very much out on the fourth initiative that Facebook's been driving in this. And finally, we need to find other ways of doing things. And this is sort of where I kind of look back to what you said about the Center of Excellence as well, because in the Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society, we do have some projects that are trying to do things basically from the outside in. So reverse engineering, if you like, observing from the outside how platforms work. Increasingly, I think we'll be pushed to that kind of research rather than via the regulated API access that might be available. So this is one of our projects, the Australian Search Experience, and I'd be very happy if everyone joins and you tell all your friends to join. Essentially, again, that's a browser plugin project. People install our plugin. The plugin runs every few hours. It needs to run on desktop or laptop computers, I have to say, unfortunately, because we haven't got the functionality for mobile. Mobiles haven't got the functionality. But it runs every few hours, and then it pops up a window, runs searches, and reports back what it sees for those searches. So this is a way for us to understand personalization of search results across the population, across different demographics in the population. So it kind of piggybacks onto your own profile. It runs our search. It doesn't access anyone's search history. We just run, some searches to see what you would see if you're running those searches, and to see if your results are different from the person next to you or person next to you. And this is our version of the Ad Observatory. We're building essentially on the New York University plugin with a few further additions and changes. So again, this is about observing the ads that people encounter in their Facebook newsfeeds. And the idea there is, again, to see, well, what do people see? To what extent is that actually visible in the Facebook ad library, which is the officially sanctioned way of accessing ads from Facebook, which we know is very limited in its functionality and in its reach. So what can we observe by, again, kind of looking over the shoulder of users as they're browsing their own Facebook feeds in terms of the ads that they're seeing? We're also very interested in seeing whether vulnerable populations are being targeted. Anecdotally, there is some evidence that indigenous populations might be targeted with alcohol and tobacco ads, for instance, which is problematic to say the least. But also that kids, underage users, might also see advertising for restricted products like, again, alcohol and tobacco. So these sorts of questions are obviously deeply problematic. We can't rely on Facebook to give us accurate data at all. So again, this is kind of the working around the restrictions by observing from the outside, by finding new ways of observing what's going on. And just one final project that we've just recently launched is the Australian version of the Poly dashboard. We're working together with people at Ryerson University, who've done this for Canada. This is essentially scraping the Facebook ad library, political ads, to make that data more easily and more usefully accessible by essentially providing a tracker for who's running what political ads in Australia, particularly obviously as we move into the federal election campaign, and who they're targeting, what demographics they're targeting. We can see from this already that the campaign is obviously starting. Needs a reminder of that, and that different parties and other groups are getting very actively targeting specific local communities and specific demographic communities with very specific advertising. And again, we're interested in what's happening there and whether there might be some problematic and potentially misleading advertising. So that's that. And I sort of, when I've talked about these things, I kind of tend to finish with kind of the kiddo and Kenseo. This is coming out of, if you know your Latin history, your Roman history, Carter the Elder always used to say, furthermore, I think that Carthage needs to be destroyed at the end of each speech, whatever he was talking about, because he didn't like Carthage. In a sense, what we as social media researchers seem to be saying, I think every time we speak, it's furthermore, we demand that social media platforms provide data access to critical independent so that we can do our work and, understand the impact of these major platforms on society, and particularly, of course, on communities. So, sorry, I've talked a little bit too long, I think, so hopefully we still have a bit of time for discussion. And, again, I'd like to thank, obviously, our various funders, including Facebook for crowdfunding. And yeah, hopefully we have a bit more time to talk. So, yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much.